On the morning of the 4th of August, 1998, a 49-year-old woman named Charlotte Waits was rushing around her kitchen in Lynette, Alabama. She reached past her husband, Barry, who was busy washing the last of the breakfast dishes at the sink, and she grabbed a clean coffee mug from the cupboard. It was a Tuesday morning, and just like any other Tuesday, they were both getting ready for what they knew would be busy days at work. Charlotte was a well-respected school administrator for the local district, and Barry was the acting mayor of their small town, a tight-knit community of about 9,000 people where everyone seemed to know everyone else. As Barry dried his hands and left the sink to go grab his briefcase from the dining room table, Charlotte, who was pouring herself a cup of coffee, reminded him about her schedule. She had a hair appointment later that morning, and she also wanted to let him know she'd probably be home later than usual. The reason was she had a difficult meeting with her attorneys that afternoon. You see, Charlotte was unfortunately in the middle of a tense and complicated legal battle. The battle was with her own cousin, a man named Wayne, and it was all over the inheritance from her late uncle's will. The uncle had been quite successful and had left a lot of valuable land directly to Charlotte. But her cousin Wayne believed that he deserved a piece of that land too. So he was formally contesting the will, and today was the day that Charlotte, Wayne, and their respective lawyers were all scheduled to meet and try to hash things out once and for all. Barry turned to Charlotte and asked if she had decided what she was going to say at this meeting. Had she made up her mind about what to do? Charlotte just shook her head and said no, she was still thinking it over. She knew deep down she didn't want to just give up the land her uncle had specifically left to her. But at the same time, she hated the idea of tearing her family apart over money. It just wasn't worth it to her. Barry walked over to where she was standing, and he put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He told her that whatever happened, no matter what she decided, the family would get through it together. He gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and then he left for work. Once Barry was out the door, Charlotte finished her coffee and left the kitchen. She walked up the stairs and knocked gently on the bedroom door of her 17-year-old daughter, Kara. As soon as her knuckles rapped against the wood, Charlotte heard a low groan from inside the room. She opened the door, just a crack, and peered inside. She found Kara curled up in bed, looking very tired and very pale. Charlotte knew this wasn't just a case of a teenager trying to get out of going to school. The reason Kara looked and sounded the way she did was because she was pregnant and she was dealing with some pretty severe morning sickness. Now, to be honest, Charlotte was not at all thrilled about her 17-year-old daughter being pregnant. But what made it even worse for her was that she absolutely could not stand Kara's boyfriend, a young man named Dave Reed. In Charlotte's eyes, Dave was nothing but trouble. He drank too much, he was constantly getting into minor scrapes with the law, and he was just not the kind of person Charlotte wanted her daughter to be with. At one point, before Kara was pregnant, Charlotte and Barry had actually forbidden her from seeing Dave. They had laid down the law and told her you cannot date him anymore. But in secret, the two teenagers had continued to see each other. And now, Kara was pregnant. So, Charlotte couldn't help but feel a deep sense of disappointment in her daughter's choices. But she also knew, more than ever, that her daughter was going to need a lot of support from her, not just to finish high school, but also to navigate the challenges of being a teen mom. So, for the time being, Charlotte was just trying to keep the peace. With that in mind, she stepped into the bedroom and softly asked Kara how she was feeling. Kara just kind of shrugged from under the covers and said she was okay, just a little nauseous. Charlotte was sympathetic and nodded. She walked around the room, tidying up a little bit as she spoke. Then she reminded Kara that her older sister, Heather, was coming home from college that night. She said it would be really nice if they could all have dinner together as a family. Kara told her that she did have a babysitting job that would take up most of the day, but she promised she would be home in time for dinner. Charlotte was pleased to hear that. She told Kara she would see her later that night, said goodbye, and then explained that she had to get going to work herself. So Charlotte left the bedroom, went back downstairs, grabbed her purse from the entryway table, and headed out through the garage to her car. Later that same morning, around 11:30, Charlotte's car was driving back down her quiet residential street, heading toward her house. She lived in a respectable, upper-middle-class neighborhood where pretty much all the neighbors knew each other by name. Historically, crime had been very low in the area. Although it was true that recently there had been a string of robberies nearby, which had put some of the residents on edge. But for the most part, Charlotte and her family always felt safe in their home. Charlotte was having a pretty hectic day. She'd had a very busy morning at work, then she'd gone to the salon for her scheduled haircut, and pretty soon she needed to get back to the office for a few more hours before her big afternoon meeting with her cousin Wayne and all the lawyers. The thing was, Charlotte never really liked how her hair looked immediately after leaving the salon. She always felt it was a bit too styled. So she wanted to make a quick stop at her house to restyle it herself before heading back to work to finish up her day. She pulled her car into the garage, got out, and ran inside the house. She went straight upstairs to the master bathroom. And just as she was plugging in her blow dryer, she heard a door open downstairs. The sound surprised her. She thought Kara was already off at her babysitting job, and Barry almost never came home for his lunch break. So she set the blow dryer down on the counter and went to go see who it was. A few hours later, around 4:30 in the afternoon, Charlotte's 21-year-old daughter Heather pulled her car up to the house. She had just arrived from her college, which was located a few towns away, and she was really excited to see her parents and her sister when they all got home from work that night. But as Heather parked her car in the driveway, she noticed something a little odd. She saw that the main garage door was wide open, and her mom's car was parked inside. This surprised her because when she had spoken to her mom on the phone the day before, Charlotte had specifically said she probably wouldn't be home until around 6 o'clock that evening. But Heather didn't think too much of it. She just figured her mom's plans had changed. So she grabbed her laundry hamper and a couple of big grocery bags filled with her belongings out of the back seat of her car. Then, as she walked into the garage to make her way into the house, she saw that the interior door, the one that led from the garage into the kitchen, was already open, but just a crack. This was also kind of strange. There was no real reason for that door to be left ajar. And so now, sensing that maybe something was a little bit off, Heather walked up to the door and slowly pushed it open. She called out for her mother, asking what she was doing home so early. But there was no answer. The house was completely silent. Heather stepped into the kitchen and set down her hamper and the bags on the floor. Then she began walking through the first floor of the house, trying to figure out where her mom was. She couldn't hear her, she couldn't see her. She walked from the kitchen, through the dining room, and as she rounded the corner into the main foyer, she saw her. Her mom was lying at the foot of the stairs, completely motionless. Heather immediately ran to her mom's side and grabbed her, trying to see if she was okay. But when she touched her mom's leg, it was ice cold to the touch. In a panic, Heather ran into the living room, snatched the phone from its cradle, and dialed 911. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Richard Carter of the Lynette Police Department sped down Charlotte's residential street with his lights flashing and his siren blaring. He was responding to a 911 call about a woman who had been found unresponsive. He had been very surprised when the dispatcher had told him whose house this woman had been found inside of. It was the home of the town's acting mayor, Barry Waits. As he pulled up in front of the home, he saw a young woman come running out the front door crying hysterically. Lieutenant Carter stopped his patrol car, got out, and he intercepted the young woman, who immediately begged him to come inside and help her mom. Carter and the young woman rushed over to the house together. He told her to stay outside on the porch while he went in to investigate. And she did. She stayed out front, just quietly weeping to herself, while Lieutenant Carter stepped through the front door. And right away, just inside the foyer, he saw what appeared to be a middle-aged woman lying on her back at the bottom of a staircase. She was completely still. Nearby, the contents of a woman's purse were strewn all across the floor. Carter immediately knelt down beside the woman and felt for a pulse on her neck, but there was nothing. So, Carter stood back up and just took a moment to assess the scene. The first thing he noticed was that there was a bit of foam at the corner of the woman's mouth. This made him wonder if maybe she had suffered a seizure or some sort of severe allergic reaction at the top of the stairs. Maybe she had lost her balance and fallen, and the fall had killed her. But then he also noticed that there were a few distinct drops of blood on the front of her blouse. And when he looked closer at her face, he saw that there were very obvious scratch marks on her chin and also a dark red mark that went all the way around her neck. And in that moment, he realized this woman had likely not just fallen down the stairs. It looked like she had been attacked, beaten, and potentially strangled to death. Later that day, around 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Richard Carter was carefully sorting through a pile of dirty laundry on the floor of Charlotte Waits' laundry room. For the past half an hour, he and his team had been scouring the crime scene for any possible clues, and now he was holding two white towels that were dotted with reddish-brown spots. They looked like blood that had just begun to dry. He called over a forensics officer and told him to bag the towels as evidence. He couldn't be sure yet that the blood even belonged to Charlotte, but if it did, it could be a very important clue. After searching the entire house, Carter actually had a pretty strong theory about what had happened to Charlotte. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere. The television and other valuables were all still in their proper places. Charlotte's purse had been dumped out on the floor just a few feet away from the stairs, but all of her cash and her credit cards were still inside her wallet. So Carter did not think this was a simple robbery gone wrong. He thought that maybe the killer had just dumped out the purse at the very end to try to make it seem like a robbery, but it was a very weak attempt. This did not look like a robbery at all. What this seemed like, at least to Carter at this point, was that Charlotte had been intentionally killed by somebody that she knew. But just then, Carter heard a commotion coming from near the front door. He went to go see what was going on, and he saw a man out on the doorstep who was literally being physically held back by two of his forensics officers. After a second, Carter recognized who it was. It was the town's mayor, Barry Waits, the victim's husband. The officers were trying to keep him outside to prevent him from seeing the scene, but Barry pushed right past them. And right away, he saw what they were trying to keep him from seeing. He saw his wife's body lying there on the floor, obviously dead. And when Barry saw that, he just froze in place and began to hyperventilate. At this point, Carter didn't try to force Barry back outside. Instead, he gently grabbed Barry's arm and led him into the next room. He sat him down on the couch and just tried to get him to calm down, but it was like he couldn't catch his breath. Barry was gasping for air and was really struggling to breathe. Then he actually doubled over and clutched at his chest. Carter thought for a second that he might be having a heart attack. So, instead of trying to talk to him, he just yelled for somebody to call an ambulance. Later that same night, around 8 o'clock, Lieutenant Carter stepped into the lobby of the local hospital's emergency department. He showed his badge to the nurse at the front desk and then asked if he could see Barry Waits. But the nurse told him he would have to wait. They were still running tests on Barry, and he couldn't have any visitors until they were absolutely sure that he was stable. Carter was pretty disappointed to hear this, not because he was desperate to get in there and console the grieving mayor. It was because he needed to talk to the mayor. As the spouse of a potential murder victim, he needed to know what Barry knew as soon as possible. So, he turned to leave. But before he did, he noticed two young women sitting in the waiting room. One of them was Barry and Charlotte's daughter, Heather. Carter and Heather had spoken for a few minutes back at the house earlier that day, when she was the one who came running out and directed him inside. They had talked a little bit, but Carter thought to himself, you know what? If I can't talk to Barry right now, maybe I can talk to Heather. Maybe she's calmed down enough that we could have a real conversation. And so, he walked over to her. As Carter approached, Heather looked up, and she definitely recognized who he was. She sort of gave off body language that it was okay for him to come and sit down. And so Carter walked over and sat down next to her. He saw that there was another girl, a teenager, sitting next to Heather. Heather quickly turned and pointed to her and said that this was her younger sister, Kara. Lieutenant Carter nodded and introduced himself to Kara. Then he asked both of them how their dad was doing. Heather explained that so far, the doctors believed he was not having a heart attack, that it was most likely a severe panic attack. But they were going to monitor him overnight just to be sure. Both of the girls seemed incredibly upset. They had tears in their eyes, and they both appeared to be in a state of shock. They hadn't really done anything suspicious, but Carter knew he couldn't just rule them out as suspects yet. He had to ask them some pointed questions. So he took out his notebook, and as delicately as he could, he began asking them what they knew. By this point, Carter's officers had already learned that Charlotte had left her work around 11 o'clock that morning. It wasn't until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon that her coworkers had called her house because she hadn't come back to the office. They said there was no answer. And so that meant the murder had likely taken place sometime between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. With that timeline in mind, Carter asked Heather and Kara where they had been during that specific window of time. Kara told him that she had been babysitting all day, and Heather said she had been at her college, which was 30 miles away, until around 4 o'clock that afternoon, when she had left to drive to her parents' house. At some point, Carter asked both of them if they had any idea if there was someone out there who might have had a grudge against their mother or who might have wanted to hurt her. The girls immediately shook their heads and said, "Absolutely not. There was no one. Their mom was wonderful and everybody seemed to like her." They insisted they were just a happy, normal family with no major issues that they knew of. Carter jotted all of this down in his notebook, and his plan was to check out the daughters' alibis as soon as he got back to the station. The next day, Lieutenant Carter was at the precinct, debriefing with the other investigators who were assigned to Charlotte's case. He had listened to the local news on the radio while he was driving to work that morning. And since Charlotte was the acting mayor's wife, her murder was all anybody in town could talk about. Carter was really feeling a lot of pressure to solve this case quickly. By this point, he had already followed up on Heather and Kara's alibis, and they had both checked out completely. Neither of the daughters could have been at the house between 11 and 1, so Carter had officially ruled them out as suspects. Now, the other officers were going around the room, basically updating Carter on what they had done the night before. And Carter was admittedly a little frustrated to hear that after they had questioned all of Charlotte's neighbors and her coworkers right after they had gotten to the scene, none of that had led to any new suspects. Another point of frustration was that the one person who likely would be able to help them the most, at least at this early stage in the investigation, was the acting mayor, Barry, Charlotte's husband, but he was still in the hospital and was not being allowed to speak to the police. But just as Carter and the other officers were sort of scratching their heads, wondering what their next move was going to be, the front door of the precinct opened. And who walked in but Barry Waits himself? A few minutes later, Lieutenant Carter and Barry were sitting in Carter's office. Barry said he had just been released from the hospital. They had determined that his heart was fine and that he had indeed just had a severe panic attack. So, as soon as he was out of the hospital, he had come right over to the police station to see what he could do to help with the investigation. Carter asked Barry to walk him through what he had done the previous day, the day that Charlotte was killed. Barry said that on top of being the acting mayor, he was also the head of the local National Guard armory, and he had been attending to business at the armory all day. He did say that he had left at some point to get a haircut, maybe mid-morning, but the barbershop had been closed, so he had gone right back to work. And he had stayed there until around 4:30, when he got a panicked phone call from his daughter Heather, telling him their mom was unresponsive in the house. As Barry spoke, Carter was primarily just looking at Barry's hands and his arms. He was looking for any scratches or cuts or bruises. The running theory, based on what they had seen at the crime scene, was that Charlotte had put up a fight against her attacker before she was killed. And so presumably, there should be wounds of some kind on the attacker, most likely on their hands and arms. But as Carter stared at Barry, he could see no visible injuries at all. And also, Barry's story seemed very linear, very simple, and he seemed very earnest about it and eager to help. So, Carter couldn't just jump to conclusions and assume that Barry was telling the truth and that he wasn't a suspect. But Carter's first impression was that Barry was being honest. At some point, Carter shifted the conversation and asked Barry if he had any idea who might have wanted to hurt his wife. And Barry said yes, he did. He said there were actually 2 people who would definitely benefit from Charlotte being dead. He explained that the first person was a guy named Dave Reed, who was their daughter Kara's boyfriend. He said that he and Charlotte had tried to stop Kara from seeing this guy because he was a bad influence, but the teens had kept sneaking around, and eventually Dave had gotten Kara pregnant. So Barry wondered if maybe Dave had gone over to the house to sort of confront Charlotte, to maybe demand to be able to see Kara, and things had gotten out of hand. Carter grabbed a pen and he wrote down Dave's full name. Then he asked about the second person who had been a problem for Charlotte. Barry explained that his wife and her cousin, Wayne, were in the middle of this contentious dispute over an inheritance. In fact, he said, Charlotte had been scheduled to meet with Wayne and their attorneys on the very same day that she was killed. And when he heard this, Carter sat up straight in his chair. He thought to himself that the timing here could not possibly be a coincidence. The cousin was suddenly his top suspect. The following day, Carter walked into an interrogation room at the Lynette police station, and he sat down across the table from two people, Wayne Rice and his attorney. When Carter had called Wayne to set up this meeting, Wayne had responded by saying he would not say a single word without his lawyer present. And this had immediately made Carter pretty suspicious. During that very brief phone call, Carter had never even suggested to Wayne that he was a suspect in his cousin's murder. So when Carter sat down with Wayne and his lawyer, he leaned right in and started to grill him. He wanted to know what was going on with this inheritance. Wayne said he knew that his contesting their uncle's will had caused a lot of problems within the family, but he swore that he hadn't wished any harm on Charlotte. In fact, he claimed she had been his best ally at the time of her death. Carter asked him to explain what he meant by that. Wayne said that the last time he spoke to Charlotte, she seemed to be in favor of giving him some of the land that their uncle had left to her. According to Wayne, Charlotte had said she was really upset about the family being torn apart over money, and she felt like keeping all the land for herself just wasn't worth the conflict. And when Carter heard this, he was pretty surprised. Barry had made it sound like Charlotte had no intention of giving up the land to Wayne, like that wasn't even an option on the table. So Carter wondered if anything Wayne was saying here was even true. He asked Wayne for his alibi, and Wayne said he had literally been at work all day at an aluminum processing plant just outside of town. He said he hadn't even left for lunch that day, which was something he typically did. He insisted he was at work, truly, all day. And then he also gave Carter the names of several of his coworkers who could confirm his whereabouts. Before Carter let Wayne go, he asked him if he could take his fingerprints. Wayne immediately looked over at his attorney. His attorney gave him a slight nod. And so Wayne looked back at Carter and said, "Okay." Later that same day, Carter sat down with the other suspect on his list, Kara's boyfriend, Dave. Dave was very moody and standoffish. He just seemed kind of annoyed that he was even there. When Carter asked him if he knew why he had been called to the station in the first place, Dave just kind of sighed and said, "Yeah, I do." He had heard about what happened to Kara's mother, and he knew that given his contentious relationship with her and her husband, that of course he was going to be viewed as a suspect, which to him was completely absurd. Carter just asked Dave point blank about his relationship with Kara's parents. Dave admitted that, yeah, they definitely didn't like him. But Dave insisted he would never hurt Charlotte or Barry for that matter. And he hadn't even been in town the day that she was killed. He had been at work all day, at a landscaping job miles away. Carter asked for the names of some of Dave's coworkers to verify his alibi, and he also asked him to provide his fingerprints. Dave sort of rolled his eyes and said, "You're wasting your time," but he agreed to do it just because he wanted to clear his name. A couple of weeks later, in the middle of August, Lieutenant Carter sat at his desk, flipping through Charlotte's autopsy report, which he had just received from the medical examiner. And he realized that Charlotte's murder had been even more brutal than he had initially thought. It turned out the murder weapon had been Charlotte's own blouse. Her killer had grabbed the two long strings that were dangling from her neckline and had used them to strangle her to death. She had also received a pretty serious head injury that could have been fatal on its own, and she also had a broken wrist. This level of violence made Carter feel even more sure that this murder had to have been personal. But as he read deeper into the report, the physical evidence seemed to paint a different picture. There were 3 sets of fingerprints that had been found at the crime scene. 2 of them belonged to Barry and Kara, which was not a surprise at all because they lived in the house. But the 3rd set of prints was unidentified. And it wasn't a match for any of the suspects on Carter's radar, including Kara's boyfriend Dave and Charlotte's cousin Wayne. So, at this point, Lieutenant Carter just felt kind of stuck. To make matters worse, Barry, Wayne, and Dave's alibis had all checked out as well. So, truly, his list of suspects was basically down to 0. If Charlotte had been killed by someone she knew, which was still the initial running theory, Carter was going to have to dig even harder to find out who it was. In October of 1998, a couple of months after Charlotte Waits was killed, Lieutenant Carter walked into the Lynette Police Precinct right as the desk sergeant was hanging up the phone. The sergeant stopped Carter and told him they had just gotten yet another call on the Charlotte Waits tip line. And before the sergeant even explained what the caller had said, Carter felt a sense of dread building in the pit of his stomach. Ever since the police had set up this tip line for information on Charlotte's murder, it had been flooded with calls basically every single day. But rather than all these tips helping with the case, the tip line had actually just slowed the investigation down. Carter and his team had to take valuable time to follow up on every single one of these leads, even though most of them were just rumors and wild conspiracy theories. By this point, from all these tips, they'd looked into a young man who lived on the same street as Charlotte and who had a history of robbing houses, but he had an airtight alibi. They had also investigated another local man who had strangled his girlfriend in a way that was similar to how Charlotte was attacked, but he also had an alibi. Carter had even driven all the way to Georgia to investigate a tip that a small-time criminal had bragged at a party about killing Charlotte, only to find out that this criminal had an alibi too, and that the tipster had made the whole story up just to get him in trouble. Adding to the confusion, their fingerprint expert had told Carter that the third unidentified set of prints found at the scene could possibly belong to a child, and so it might be totally unrelated to the murder. So now, as Carter looked over at the desk sergeant who was getting ready to tell him about whatever call he had just had, Carter just braced himself for more bad news, because all these tip calls were basically bad news. And when the desk sergeant spoke, it was indeed more bad news. The sergeant said this call wasn't even a tip at all. A local woman had just called in to complain about the lack of progress in the investigation. As difficult as it was for Carter to hear that now, in addition to all the pressure he was feeling that locals were literally spamming the hotline just to complain about him, he also understood their frustration. He was feeling just as upset as everybody else in town. But after running into nothing but dead ends, he was completely out of ideas. And he had a sinking feeling in his gut that unless something major changed soon, this case, unfortunately, was going to go cold. Fast forward about 3 years to one morning in 2001. On this day, Lieutenant Carter was working at his desk when he heard a familiar sound. The precinct's tip line was ringing yet again. After that initial wave of tips on the Charlotte Waits case, the investigation had completely stalled out for a couple of years. It was basically cold. Carter had ultimately been reassigned to other cases, and Charlotte's family had just sort of been forced to move on without any sort of closure. Kara had her baby, and Heather had graduated from college and was working a real job. And Barry had also basically moved on with his life. He had gotten remarried and was still very much involved in local politics. In fact, just the previous year, he had run for a term on the city council. However, during that election cycle, Barry's opponent had publicly accused him of killing his wife Charlotte. And even though he had no actual evidence to support his accusation, aside from the bizarre fact that he had a dream about it, all the media attention from these accusations had totally reinvigorated the case. And calls had once again begun flowing into the tip line. However, just like before, the vast majority of these tips were just wild theories and local gossip. But on that particular day, when the desk sergeant who manned the tip line opened up Carter's office door, Carter looked up and saw that the sergeant was visibly excited. Whatever he had just heard on the tip line actually mattered. And before Carter could even ask him what he had heard, the desk sergeant said he had just spoken to 2 tipsters who clearly had some real information that they wanted to share, information that was going to blow this case wide open. Based on that crucial tip, the forensic evidence and new witness testimony, this is what police believe actually happened to Charlotte Waits on the 4th of August, 1998. Around 11:30 in the morning, the killer pulled up outside of Charlotte's house, and right away, they recognized Charlotte's car parked in the garage. When they saw it, their heart raced with a mix of excitement and anxiety because they hadn't been sure that she would even be home. But clearly, the killer had arrived at just the right time. So they parked their car at the end of the driveway, they walked up into the open garage, and they went over to the interior door that led into the house. They tried the handle and found that it was unlocked. So they opened it up. The killer stepped inside the kitchen, and right away they heard footsteps on the second floor. They knew it had to be Charlotte. There was nobody else home at this time of day. The killer quietly closed the door behind them. They went around to the stairs that led to the second floor, and up they went. And right as the killer reached the second floor hallway, Charlotte came out of the bathroom and saw them standing there. Charlotte was definitely very surprised to see them. The killer immediately just asked her a question, point blank. And when she answered the question, it was not what the killer wanted to hear. So, the killer tried to get her to change her mind to answer this question differently. But the conversation quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. And then, the killer just totally lost their temper and hit Charlotte hard across the face. Blood immediately began pouring from Charlotte's nose. Stunned, she just stepped back and went back into the bathroom to grab a towel to blot her face with it. At this point, the killer knew they had crossed a line. Persuading Charlotte to do what they wanted was now clearly out of the question. This was a point of no return. So, as Charlotte came out of the bathroom with a towel pressed to her face, looking totally shaken up, the killer walked up and grabbed her from behind. They clutched the long strings that were hanging from the neckline of her blouse, and they pulled them tight around her neck. Charlotte began gasping for breath and trying to fight them off, but the killer had her in an unbreakable chokehold. And then finally, when Charlotte had lost enough oxygen that she stopped struggling, the killer let go of the strings and then kicked her down the staircase. When the killer saw what they had done, when they saw Charlotte at the base of the stairs, motionless and very likely dead, the reality of what had just happened finally hit them. In a panic, they grabbed the bloody towel that Charlotte had dropped on the floor. They rushed down the stairs and quickly cleaned up the rest of the blood on Charlotte's face, and then they dumped the towels in the laundry room. Then, they grabbed Charlotte's purse off a nearby table and scattered its contents on the floor near her body, hoping the police would think this was just a robbery gone wrong. And then after that, they fled the house, got back in their car, and hurried back to work at the National Guard Armory before anyone even noticed they were gone. The killer was Lynette, Alabama's mayor and Charlotte's own husband, Barry Waits. Barry had secretly gotten himself into a lot of debt, and he needed the full inheritance from Charlotte's uncle to pay it all off. And so when Barry went to his own home in the middle of the day and confronted Charlotte, asking her, "What do you plan to do at this meeting with Wayne? Are you going to give him some of this inheritance?" And she told him that yes, her plan was to settle and split the inheritance. Well, when Barry heard that, he snapped. He killed his wife. Not just because he was mad at her for her decision, but also because he desperately needed more money. He was thinking, okay, I'm only going to get half of this inheritance because she's giving the other half to Wayne. But if I kill her, I'll also get her life insurance policy, and then together I'll have enough to pay off my debts. However, when the insurance company went to pay out the claim, because Barry was clearly a suspect in his wife's murder early on in the investigation, the company refused to pay him the money. Instead, they paid the insurance money directly to their daughters, Heather and Cara. But a couple of years later, Barry still tried to get his hands on that money by tricking his own daughters into signing it over to him. But when Heather and Cara realized what he was doing, they finally saw their father for what he truly was. And so, it was the daughters who were the tipsters who broke this case wide open. They told Lieutenant Carter everything they knew about their dad's very suspicious behavior, along with his clear financial motives for the murder. They also said that their father had intimidated them into hiding information from the police and had even called in fake tips himself to redirect attention away from him. Barry Waits was arrested in February of 2006, and 9 months later, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Our story begins in northeast Brazil in April of 1977. Apolinario Correa and his 3 brothers, Firmino, Oriano, and Jose, were hard workers. They made their living in a tough but honest way. They were lumberjacks, but not in the traditional sense of working in a vast forest. Their territory was a small, uninhabited island just off the coast called Ilha dos Caranguejos, or Crab Island. The brothers had a sturdy boat, and they'd make regular trips out to the island, chop down valuable timber, load it onto their boat, and sail back to the mainland to sell it to local construction companies. It was a good business. The wood from Crab Island was high quality, and because they were the only ones willing to go there, they had the whole place to themselves. And there was a very specific reason they were the only ones willing to go there. Most people in their coastal community were terrified of Crab Island. For generations, stories had been passed down. Spooky stories. People who had dared to venture onto the island, maybe for a picnic or to explore, would come back with unsettling tales. They'd talk about hearing strange voices whispering from deep within the island's dense forest, especially after the sun went down. This was particularly strange because everyone knew for a fact that nobody lived on the island. There were no homes, no shacks, nothing. And then there were the lights. Fishermen out on the water at night would sometimes see bizarre, colorful lights flashing and dancing above the treetops of Crab Island, with no logical explanation. It was a place steeped in local folklore, a place most people gave a wide berth. But the Correa brothers were practical men. Apolinario, the oldest, was level-headed. Firmino was strong and quiet. Oriano was the joker of the group, and Jose, the youngest, looked up to them all. They had heard the stories their whole lives, but they just didn't buy into them. To them, the whispers were just the wind in the trees, and the lights were probably just swamp gas or some other natural phenomenon. The fear their neighbors had was actually a business advantage. It meant no competition. So they went to Crab Island all the time, and it was always the same. Just them, the trees, and the sound of the ocean. It was just another job site. On the morning of the 25th of April, 1977, the four brothers readied their boat for another trip. The plan was simple, the same one they'd executed dozens of times. They would set off in the morning and aim to arrive at the island around noon, which was high tide. This was important because the waters around Crab Island were very shallow, surrounded by vast mudflats. You could only get the boat close to the shore during high tide. They'd anchor the boat, wade to the island, and spend the entire afternoon felling trees. As the tide went out, their boat would eventually come to rest on the soft mud, stranded until the tide came back in. This was all part of the plan. They didn't intend to sail back right away. They'd finish their work, cook dinner over a campfire on the beach, and then head back to the boat to get a few hours of sleep. By the time they woke up around midnight, the next high tide would have lifted their boat free from the mud, and they could begin the peaceful journey home under the stars. It was a solid, well-rehearsed plan. And so, that's exactly what they did. They arrived at Crab Island at about 12 p.m., the sun high in the sky. The day was hot and humid, and the work was grueling. For hours, the only sounds on the island were the rhythmic thud of their axes against wood and the crash of falling trees. They worked until their muscles ached and their shirts were soaked with sweat. As evening approached, the sky turned a brilliant orange and purple. They gathered up their tools and built a small, crackling campfire on the beach. They cooked their simple dinner of fish and rice, talking and laughing as they always did. They probably made fun of the ghost stories, feeling perfectly safe and content on their island. Around 8 p.m., after they'd finished eating, Apolinario took a bucket of seawater and carefully doused the campfire, making sure every last ember was extinguished. The only light now came from the moon, casting long shadows across the beach. The tide was fully out. Their boat was sitting about 100 yards away, a dark silhouette resting on the glistening mudflats. The four brothers took off their boots, rolled up their pants, and began the familiar trudge through the thick, ankle-deep mud towards their vessel. They climbed aboard, rinsed the mud from their feet, and went into the small main cabin. It was cramped, but it was shelter. They laid out their sleeping pads on the floor, and exhausted from the day's labor, it didn't take long for all four of them to fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. Apolinario had only meant to sleep for a few hours, just until the tide came back in. But when he opened his eyes again, he knew instantly that something was wrong. The air inside the cabin was still and dark, but through the small porthole window, he could see that the sky outside wasn't black anymore. It was that soft, hazy pink of early dawn. He let out a frustrated groan. They had all slept right through the midnight high tide. Their boat had been lifted by the water, and then, as the tide receded again, it had settled right back down into the mud. They were stuck. Again. Now they'd have to wait all the way until the next high tide, likely around noon. A whole half-day wasted. Annoyed, Apolinario sat up and looked around the small cabin to see if his brothers were awake. He saw the familiar lumps of his two brothers, Firmino and Jose, still asleep on their pads. They each had their thin blankets pulled up right over their faces to block out the morning light. But then his eyes fell on the third sleeping pad, the one belonging to his brother, Oriano. It was empty. The blanket was tossed aside. Oriano wasn't in the cabin. Apolinario wasn't immediately alarmed. Oriano was an early riser. He was probably just outside on the deck, getting some fresh air, or answering the call of nature. But just as Apollinario was thinking this, the sound hit him. A piercing, blood-curdling scream from just outside the cabin door. It was a sound of absolute, unimaginable pain. It was Oriano's voice. In a split second, Apollinario's annoyance at oversleeping was replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline and fear. He scrambled to his feet, threw open the cabin door, and rushed out onto the deck. And what he saw made him freeze in his tracks. There was his brother, Oriano, standing there, clutching at his own body, his face twisted in a mask of agony. His skin, all of his exposed skin on his face, his neck, his arms, was a mess of horrific burns. It looked like someone had taken a blowtorch to him. It was red and blistering, and in some places, it looked like it was literally peeling away from the muscle. Apollinario was so horrified he couldn't move. His brain just couldn't process what he was seeing. And then, through the shock, he noticed something that was even stranger, something that made absolutely no sense. Despite the terrible burns that covered his brother's body, Oriano's clothes, his simple work shirt and pants, were perfectly fine. They weren't scorched, they weren't singed, there wasn't a single mark on them. It was as if his skin had spontaneously caught on fire from the inside out, while leaving his clothes completely untouched. Oriano was just screaming and screaming, stumbling around the deck in pure agony, and Apollinario had no idea what to do, no idea what could have possibly caused this. While Apollinario stood there, frozen in shock, he heard another sound. This one was coming from back inside the cabin where he had just been. It was a low, guttural moaning, a sound of deep suffering. Acting on pure instinct, he spun around and ran back into the cabin. He knew the sound was coming from one of his other two brothers, who were still under their blankets. He lurched towards the closest one, Firmino, and tore the blanket off of him. The sight was just as horrifying as what he'd seen on deck. Firmino was writhing on his sleeping pad, moaning in pain, and his skin was just as horribly burned as Oriano's. It was raw and red and looked like it was sliding off his body. And just like with Oriano, Firmino's clothes were completely undamaged. Apollinario's mind was reeling. What was happening? Was this a nightmare? His eyes darted over to his last brother, Jose, who was still lying on his sleeping pad, the blanket still covering him. He was quiet. He wasn't moaning. Maybe he was okay. With a trembling hand, Apollinario reached over and pulled back Jose's blanket. Jose was not burned. There wasn't a mark on him. But he was not okay. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling of the cabin. He wasn't breathing. Jose was dead. The next 6 hours must have been the longest and most torturous of Apollinario's life. He was on a tiny boat, stuck in the mud, on a supposedly haunted island. His brother Oriano was outside, still screaming in agony from his mysterious burns. His brother Firmino was inside, barely conscious and fading fast from his own horrific injuries. And his youngest brother Jose was lying dead just a few feet away. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't call for help, they had no radio, and he couldn't leave. He had to simply wait, surrounded by death and suffering, for the tide to slowly, agonizingly creep back in and lift their boat from the mud. He tried to comfort his injured brothers, to give them water, to do anything, but he was completely helpless. Finally, around noon, the water was high enough, the boat lifted, and Apollinario was free. He started the engine and raced back towards the mainland, his mind a chaotic storm of grief and confusion. When they finally reached their home port, a small crowd gathered, shocked at the scene. Oriano, who was badly hurt but still conscious and able to walk, stayed behind with the body of their brother Jose, waiting for the authorities. Apollinario knew Firmino's injuries were the most severe. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, and his body looked like it was shutting down. Apollinario had to get him to a hospital, and fast. He managed to get his brother into a vehicle and sped off towards the nearest medical facility. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed out to help. Firmino was barely clinging to life. As they got him onto a gurney and started wheeling him into the emergency room, a doctor leaned in close to him. The doctor knew they needed to understand what had happened to treat these bizarre injuries. He asked Firmino, "What happened? How did you get these burns?" Firmino's eyes fluttered open. He was barely able to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. But right before he slipped into a deep coma from his burns, he was able to get out a few chilling words. He told the doctor that sometime during the night, while they were all asleep in the boat on Crab Island, he had woken up for a moment. He had looked out the small porthole window from inside the cabin. And what he saw, he said, was an inexplicable ball of fire just hovering in the air outside the boat. And that was the last thing he remembered. The local police were notified immediately, and they opened an investigation into the bizarre and tragic events on Crab Island. They were faced with a case that seemed to defy all logic. One man dead with no apparent cause, two men with catastrophic burns that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and one man, Apollinario, who was completely unharmed and completely bewildered. The first person they spoke to at length was Apollinario. He told them everything he could remember, from their normal workday to the horrifying discovery in the morning. He was clearly traumatized, and his story, as strange as it was, seemed genuine. The investigators had to consider all possibilities, no matter how unlikely. Their first theory was that some sort of fight had broken out among the brothers. Maybe an argument over money or work had escalated into extreme violence. Perhaps Apollinario was lying to cover up his own involvement. But this theory quickly fell apart. The Correa brothers were known to be very close. There was no history of violence or serious arguments between them. And, more importantly, this theory couldn't explain the physical evidence. How could a fight result in two men being burned so severely while their clothes remained untouched? And how did Jose die without a single mark on him? An autopsy would later be performed on Jose, and the coroner was stumped. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, likely brought on by extreme shock or terror. But what had terrified him to death? The police then considered the possibility of drugs or alcohol. Maybe the men had consumed some sort of hallucinogen, and in their altered state they had hurt themselves or each other. This could potentially explain their strange stories and lack of memory. But toxicology reports were run on all the brothers, including Jose. They all came back completely clean. There were no drugs, no unusual levels of alcohol, nothing in their systems that could explain what had happened. So, the investigators moved on to environmental factors. The most plausible, though still far-fetched, theory they could come up with was a freak lightning strike. Their idea was that maybe lightning had struck the wet beach or the water near the boat, and somehow the electrical charge had reflected off the sand or the water and shot into the boat, striking the men. But the experts they consulted said this was incredibly unlikely. A lightning strike powerful enough to inflict those kinds of burns would have left obvious signs of its passing. It would have scorched the boat, maybe blown a hole in the hull, or damaged the boat's electronics. But when the police forensics team went out to Crab Island to examine the boat and the surrounding area, they found nothing. The boat was completely undamaged. There were no scorch marks, no signs of an explosion or a fire. The beach was pristine. There were no unusual craters or fused sand that a lightning strike would leave behind. In fact, the big takeaway from the on-site investigation was that they found absolutely no evidence of anything unusual happening at all. It was as if the island itself was hiding its secrets. The only piece of information that pointed to something truly strange was Firmino's dying declaration about the ball of fire. The police had to consider it, but what could they do with it? To them, it sounded like the hallucination of a man in extreme pain and shock. A ball of fire hovering in the air? It sounded like something from a science fiction story, not a police report. With no physical evidence, no witnesses who could remember anything, and no logical explanation, the investigation hit a dead end. Miraculously, both Firmino and Oriano survived. They spent months in the hospital undergoing painful treatments and skin grafts. They eventually made full physical recoveries. But the mental and emotional scars remained. And strangest of all, neither of them ever regained any memory of what happened that night. Their last clear memory was of going to sleep in the cabin. The next thing they knew, they were in unimaginable pain. The period in between was a complete and total blank. With their two key witnesses unable to provide any details, and with a total lack of evidence, the police had no choice but to close the case. The official file on the death of Jose Correa and the injuries of his brothers was stamped unsolved, with no official explanation ever given. The Correa family was left to grieve without answers, and the terrifying mystery of Crab Island only grew deeper. For 9 years, life went on. The surviving Correa brothers never returned to Crab Island. They found other ways to make a living. But the story of what happened to them became a legendary cautionary tale in their community. The island, which had always been considered haunted, was now seen as a place of genuine, tangible danger. People avoided it more than ever. The strange stories, however, didn't stop. Fishermen continued to report seeing odd lights in the sky over the island. But for 9 years, no one was brave or foolish enough to spend the night there. Then, in April of 1986, almost 9 years to the day after the Correa brothers' ordeal, a different crew of men decided to tempt fate. It was a team of 4 lumberjacks, unrelated to the Correas, who were new to the area. They heard that the timber on Crab Island was plentiful and untouched. They likely heard the stories as well, but just like the Correa brothers before them, they probably dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. They were there to do a job and make money, not to hunt for ghosts. Their plan was almost identical to the one the Correas had used. They sailed to the island, spent the day harvesting lumber, and as evening fell, they settled in for the night, planning to leave on the next high tide. They were out in the woods, not far from the beach, when suddenly all 4 of them recalled hearing a single, loud, crashing sound echo through the forest. It was a noise they couldn't identify. And right after they heard that sound, all 4 of them, at the exact same moment, simply fell unconscious. They didn't feel sick, they didn't feel dizzy. It was like a switch was flipped and their consciousness was just turned off. When they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. They were disoriented, confused, with massive gaps in their memory. As they slowly came to their senses and took stock of their situation, a horrifying sense of déjà vu fell over the island. One of the 4 men was dead. He had no visible injuries, no marks on his body. He was just gone. And another one of the men was inexplicably covered in severe burns. And just like with Firmino and Oriano 9 years earlier, the survivors' clothes were perfectly intact. The 2 other men were unharmed, but in a state of shock. When authorities investigated this second incident, they were faced with the exact same impossible puzzle. The survivors had no memory of what happened between hearing the crashing sound and waking up 18 hours later. The autopsy on the deceased man was, once again, inconclusive, pointing to a probable heart attack induced by terror. And the man with the burns couldn't explain how he got them. A thorough search of the island once again revealed nothing. No footprints, no scorch marks, no evidence of any kind. It was a near-perfect carbon copy of the tragedy that had befallen the Correa brothers. The 2 incidents, separated by 9 years, are so chillingly similar that it's hard to dismiss them as coincidence. In both cases, a group of lumberjacks spent the night on the island. In both cases, one person died of unexplained causes, appearing to be scared to death. In both cases, at least one other person suffered severe, unexplainable burns that did not affect their clothing. And in both cases, the survivors had complete amnesia of the event itself. So, what is really happening on Crab Island? To this day, no one knows for sure. The official case files remain closed and unsolved. But there are theories, though they venture far from conventional explanations. Some people believe the island is home to a paranormal entity, a malevolent spirit that attacks those who trespass on its territory. The voices and the lights that people have reported for decades could be signs of this presence. Others look towards a more extraterrestrial explanation. The description Firmino gave of a ball of fire hovering in the air sounds very similar to many UFO sightings, specifically reports of ball lightning or unidentified aerial phenomena. The burns, which spared clothing, are consistent with injuries caused by intense microwave radiation, a technology often associated with advanced non-human craft. Perhaps these men stumbled upon something not of this world, something that reacted defensively and with lethal force. Whatever the truth is, the story of the Korea brothers and the second crew serves as a haunting reminder that there are still mysteries in this world that we cannot explain. For the families involved, there is no closure, only the lingering pain of loss and the endless, unanswerable question of what truly happened on those nights. Crab Island remains uninhabited, a place of quiet beauty by day and a place of profound, terrifying mystery by night. It stands as a silent monument to a series of events that defy logic and blur the line between folklore and a dark, terrifying reality. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. The Green Void, the Mato Grosso Expedition. In the summer of 2017, a commercial logging crew was cutting a new access road deep in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, about 300 miles away from any paved highway. It is a part of the Amazon basin, where the canopy is so thick that the ground is just in perpetual twilight, and you can't see more than 10 feet in front of your face. While clearing a patch of heavy vines, one of the operators spotted something unnatural in the mud. It was a bright orange, heavy-duty Pelican case. Inside, wrapped in a plastic Ziploc bag, was a high-capacity SD card. When Brazilian authorities finally managed to recover the corrupted video files from that card, what they saw didn't make any sense. The footage showed 3 young American men, and honestly, they didn't look like seasoned explorers. They were covered in mud, completely emaciated, and they looked absolutely terrified. But the thing that really disturbed the investigators wasn't the sheer panic in the men's voices. It was what was visible in the background of the video. Just behind the tree line, barely visible through the torrential rain, were massive, perfectly straight, carved stone columns. And there are no ancient stone columns supposed to be anywhere in that part of the Amazon. But to understand how those 3 guys ended up screaming into a camera in the middle of an uncharted jungle, we have to go back to a very normal, very messy apartment in a sprawling suburb of Columbus, Ohio, about 8 months earlier. Marcus Thorne was 28 years old, and he was not an adventurer. He was a mid-level data analyst for a regional auto insurance firm. His daily life consisted of endless spreadsheets, sitting in traffic on Interstate 71, and drinking stale, lukewarm coffee from the office break room. But Marcus had a deep, almost unhealthy obsession with satellite archaeology. He would spend hours every single night glued to his dual monitors, scanning high-resolution topographical maps of the Amazon basin. He was looking for the lost city of Kuhikugu, or maybe even the legendary city of Z that Percy Fawcett disappeared trying to find back in the 1920s. And then, one night in November, at around 3 a.m., surrounded by crumpled junk mail and empty energy drink cans, Marcus found something. It was a faint, perfectly geometric shadow on the satellite feed. A massive square, measuring almost exactly 500 feet by 500 feet, hidden under the canopy, about 40 miles east of a remote tributary of the Xingu River. And Marcus was convinced he had just discovered the archaeological find of the century. So he pitched the idea to his younger brother David and their childhood friend Eric. They were just regular guys. They spent their weekends watching football and going to local breweries. But the idea of being the ones to discover a lost civilization was intoxicating. So they spent thousands of dollars at REI. They bought top-of-the-line, moisture-wicking shirts, expensive hiking boots, GPS communicators, and machetes. They really thought it was just going to be an extreme camping trip, a crazy 2-week vacation that would give them the ultimate story to tell back home. They had absolutely no idea what they were walking into. And the first few days of the expedition actually went exactly according to plan. They flew into Cuiabá, took a rattling bus to the edge of the river, and hired a local guide named Hector who had a motorized aluminum boat. They traveled upriver for 3 days, pushing deeper and deeper into the green maze. The physical discomfort was immediate and intense. It was 100 degrees outside with 95% humidity, and the air was so thick it felt like breathing through a wet towel. The mosquitoes were relentless, biting right through their expensive gear. But they were excited. The camera footage from those first few days shows them laughing, drinking warm beers, and pointing out exotic birds. N. But then, on the morning of the fourth day, the reality of their situation began to fracture. They had set up camp on a muddy riverbank the night before, planning to start the 40-mile overland trek at dawn. When Marcus unzipped his tent at 6 a.m., the first thing he noticed was that Hector's hammock was empty. At first, it made sense. Hector was probably just down by the river checking the boat. But when Marcus walked down to the water, the boat was still securely tied to a thick mangrove root. Hector's heavy rubber boots were still sitting right outside his tent. His machete was still leaning against a log. But Hector was just gone. He had vanished into the jungle barefoot. And as Marcus stood there, trying to process why an experienced guide would wander into the Amazon without his boots or his blade, Eric walked up behind him, holding their expensive satellite GPS device. The screen wasn't dead, it had full battery, but the map was completely gone, replaced by a single flashing error code that just read, "No signal." And that's when David stepped out of his tent and pointed out the most disturbing detail of all. The Amazon jungle is famously loud, a constant, deafening roar of cicadas, howling monkeys, and birds. But as the three men stood there on the muddy bank, looking at the empty boots, they realized the jungle was completely, absolutely dead silent. You don't really understand how terrifying true silence is until you experience it in a place that is supposed to be deafening. The Amazon is a living, breathing machine. It is supposed to scream. But standing there on that muddy bank, Marcus, Eric, and David heard absolutely nothing. No water lapping against the aluminum hull, no wind in the canopy, nothing. And honestly, human psychology is a funny thing because when faced with the impossible, your brain immediately scrambles to build a logical bridge. David, who grew up in Tornado Alley in Oklahoma, was the first to break the silence. He wiped the sweat off his forehead and said, "It's a barometric pressure drop." And at that point, it made perfect sense. In the Midwest, right before a massive supercell hits, the birds stop singing, the insects go quiet, the air gets incredibly heavy. A massive tropical storm was rolling in, which brings us to Hector. If a massive storm was coming, Hector, an indigenous guide who had spent his entire life on this river, would know it. He wouldn't need his boots or his machete if he was just running 50 feet up the bank to grab some broadleaf palm fronds to cover the boat's outboard motor. He probably woke up, felt the pressure drop, and rushed to secure their perimeter. The GPS glitch? Heavy cloud cover and atmospheric interference. It was a perfectly neat, perfectly logical explanation. They convinced themselves that everything was fine. They just needed to batten down the hatches and wait for the rain. So they waited. They sat in their expensive REI camping chairs, drinking lukewarm water from their Nalgene's, staring up at the canopy. 1 hour passed. Then 2. By 11 a.m., the temperature had climbed to 104 degrees. The humidity was suffocating, but the sky visible through the trees remained a brutal, unbroken, blinding blue. There was no storm, there was no wind, and the silence never broke. That was when the false reality they had built for themselves completely collapsed. Marcus couldn't take the waiting anymore. He grabbed his machete and walked up the muddy embankment into the tree line, calling out Hector's name. Eric and David followed close behind. About 30 feet into the dense foliage, they found Hector's footprints in the soft, dark mud. But the moment they looked at the tracks, the bottom dropped out of their stomachs. The footprints didn't make sense. They were deep, indicating a lot of weight or force, but they were spaced almost 12 feet apart. No human being on Earth has a 12-foot running stride, especially not barefoot in knee-deep Amazonian muck. And there were no drag marks, no signs of slipping. It looked as if Hector had been bounding through the jungle like a gazelle, or, as David later whispered to the investigators, as if he was being carried away by something massive that only touched the ground every 12 feet. But it got worse. A few yards further, they found Hector's handheld VHF radio. It was lying in the center of a massive, crushed fern. Eric picked it up, and his hands started shaking. The radio wasn't just broken. The thick, military-grade plastic casing was warped and melted as if it had been exposed to a blast of localized extreme heat. But the leaves underneath it were perfectly green and unburned. The logic was completely gone. They were 200 miles from civilization, their guide had vanished in a physically impossible way, their electronics were dead, and the jungle was still holding its breath, watching them. Marcus was the first to break the paralysis. He didn't say a word. He just turned around, dropping his expensive machete into the mud, and sprinted back toward the riverbank. And honestly, you can't blame him. When your brain encounters something so fundamentally wrong, so entirely outside the boundaries of physics and reality, survival instinct takes over. It is a very ugly, very selfish thing. Eric and David were right behind him. They didn't look for Hector anymore, they just ran. When they reached the boat, the panic really set in. Eric grabbed the pull cord for the outboard motor and yanked it. The cord didn't resist, it just crumbled in his hand. The internal plastic components of the motor had melted together into a useless, fused lump of slag, just like the radio. So, they untied the mooring line and they paddled. They drifted downriver for 4 days. 4 days of blistering 100-degree heat, drinking untreated river water that gave them violent dysentery, jumping at every single splash, and never, ever speaking. They were completely silent. When a Brazilian logging barge finally spotted them drifting about 40 miles upstream from Manaus, they were severely dehydrated and covered in sandfly bites. And this is where the procedural messiness of real life always ruins the adventure. There was no grand rescue. They were just hauled into a sterile, concrete interrogation room at the federal police headquarters. You know the kind of room, flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of stale cigarette smoke, drinking terrible instant coffee out of little plastic cups. The investigators thought they had murdered Hector. And at that point, it made sense. 3 rich Americans go into the jungle, only 3 come out. It's a tale as old as time down there. The lead detective practically laughed in their faces when David tried to explain the 12-foot footprints and the melted radio. They were facing life in a Brazilian prison. But then, the police confiscated their gear, including David's camera. David was old school. He shot on a mechanical Leica 35mm because, as he always said, batteries die in the humidity. The police developed the film hoping to find evidence of a struggle. Instead, they found something else. About 12 hours into the interrogation, the detective walked back into the room. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked pale, sick almost. He didn't say a word. He just slid an 8x10 glossy photograph across the scratched metal table. David looked at it, and his mind just stopped working. It was the picture he had taken of the canopy that morning, right before Marcus had run into the tree line. David had taken it to document the weird, unbroken blue sky. But looking at the developed photo, the truth finally collapsed on them. It wasn't the sky. The blue was too flat, too matte, too perfect. And running straight through the upper third of the frame, partially obscured by the mahogany branches, was a perfectly straight geometric seam. They hadn't been looking at the atmosphere, they had been looking at the underside of something massive. Something metallic, painted a perfect camouflage blue, hovering completely silently, maybe 200 feet above the canopy. And in the bottom right corner of the frame, blurred by violent upward motion, was a shape. A human shape suspended 50 feet in the air, being pulled straight up into the blue mass. Which brings us to the realization. The suffocating heat, the dead silence, the melted electronics that left the leaves completely unburned. It wasn't a storm rolling in, it was exhaust. A localized, highly focused thermal displacement from whatever propulsion system was keeping that massive structure quietly suspended above their camp. Hector hadn't been running away. He had been dragged upward, his boots only touching the mud every 12 feet as he fought against the gravity pulling him into the sky. The aftermath of something like this is never cinematic. It's just sad, and it leaves a permanent stain on your life. The U.S. Embassy got involved. There were closed-door meetings, non-disclosure agreements shoved in their faces by men in very cheap suits, and then they were quietly put on a red-eye flight back to Miami. Eric moved back to a cookie-cutter suburb outside of Dallas. He rarely goes outside now. He keeps his house at a freezing 65 degrees, and he keeps a box fan running on high in every single room, 24/7, because he is absolutely terrified of silence. He needs the white noise to prove to himself that the air is moving. And David? David tried to move on. He tried to rationalize it as a military drone test, some classified black site project. But last October, the lingering trauma finally caught up to him. He was cleaning out his garage in Ohio, sorting through old plastic bins. And at the bottom of one of the bins, under a pile of mildewed canvas tents, he found his old Garmin GPS. The one that had completely died in the jungle. It was turned on. The screen was glowing faintly in the dim garage. The battery icon was completely full, and honestly, that should be impossible after 3 years sitting in a box. But it gets worse. David picked it up, his hands trembling, and looked at the display. It wasn't showing a map of his neighborhood. It was showing a single active waypoint, a proximity alert. The coordinates were identical to his exact location, right there in his garage. But the altitude reading wasn't ground level. The altitude reading was 500 feet. And as David stared at the little pixelated numbers, the reading dropped 400 feet. 300 feet. 200 feet. David slowly walked out onto his concrete driveway, stood in the middle of his quiet suburban cul-de-sac, and looked up at the perfectly blue, totally silent sky. The 7-2-hour wager. When a missing persons case hits a detective's desk, they usually look for the standard markers of a struggle. Shattered glass, a dropped cell phone, maybe a smear of blood on the pavement. But when police found 2 8-year-old Claire Vance's dark gray Honda Civic idling in the empty parking lot of a local nature reserve, there was no violence at all. The driver's side door was firmly shut. The heater was still blasting. Her purse was sitting neatly on the passenger seat, right next to a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee. The only thing out of place was a perfectly folded, heavy-stock paper card taped to the center of the steering wheel. Inside, typed in a neat clinical serif font, were 3 sentences. The game has begun. She has 72 hours to find the exit. If you try to intervene, the walls close early. Now, before we dive into the psychology of a man who treated human lives like disposable puzzle pieces, if you're the kind of person who eats a string cheese by biting directly into the center of it like a complete psychopath, go ahead and carefully detach the like button, dip it in room temperature milk, and stick it to the ceiling of your local DMV. It just feels right. Is less than BR is greater than is less than BR is greater than. And honestly, looking back at Claire's life, there was absolutely nothing about her that would make her a target for this kind of elaborate, theatrical nightmare. She wasn't wealthy. She didn't have a high-profile job with dangerous enemies. Claire worked as an inventory manager at a mid-sized regional logistics firm in Ohio. Her days consisted of staring at spreadsheets, drinking stale break room coffee, and driving home in the dark because it was mid-November and the sun set before 5 o'clock. She was the kind of person who kept a spare umbrella in her trunk and always double-checked that her front door was locked before going to bed. The mundane, ordinary rhythm of her life is actually what makes her case so deeply disturbing. It means this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of selection. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. The timeline of her disappearance starts on a Tuesday evening. It had been raining, freezing drizzle all afternoon, that miserable kind of Midwest weather that just sinks into your bones and makes everything look gray. Claire left the warehouse around 5:30 p.m. We know this because security cameras caught her pulling out of the employee lot, and later, detectives would trace her route, finding no deviations. She drove straight home to her duplex in a quiet, slightly older neighborhood with big oak tree and uneven sidewalks. At this point, the night feels perfectly, boringly normal. She parks in her driveway, grabs her purse, and walks up to her covered porch. But as she reaches for her keys, she notices something. There is a small, manila envelope resting perfectly in the center of her welcome mat. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. Now, most people wouldn't immediately panic at the sight of an envelope. And Claire didn't either. She assumed it was a notice from her landlord or maybe a flyer for a local landscaping company that blew up onto the porch. She picked it up, unlocked her door, and went inside. She locked the deadbolt behind her, a habit so ingrained she probably didn't even register doing it. She dropped her keys in the little ceramic bowl by the door, took off her wet coat, and carried the envelope into the kitchen. The house was quiet, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of cars hissing on the wet pavement outside. She turned on the overhead kitchen light, grabbed a butter knife, and sliced the envelope open. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Claire pulled it out and stared at it. It was a picture of her own kitchen window, taken from the outside, looking in. But it wasn't an old photo. In the picture, the overhead kitchen light was on, and she could see the back of her own head standing exactly where she was standing right now, holding the envelope. The photograph had been taken seconds ago. Is less than BR, is greater than. Is less than BR, is greater than. It's in these quiet, terrifying moments that the human brain tries desperately to rationalize. You don't jump straight to the thought that a predator is hunting you. You think, is this a prank? Did one of my coworkers follow me home? Claire froze. Her heart started a heavy, slow thud against her ribs. She didn't scream. Instead, she did that deeply human, awkward thing. She slowly turned her head toward the kitchen window, almost afraid to look, hoping the yard would be empty. The glass was dark, reflecting only her own pale face and the yellow light of the kitchen. She couldn't see anything out in the rainy yard. But then, her phone buzzed on the counter. A text message from an unknown number. It read, "Good. You're paying attention. The front door is now locked from the outside. Don't try the windows. Rule number 1. You have to play." Now, if you're hearing this, you're probably yelling at the story in your head. You're thinking, break the glass. Call 911. Scream until the neighbors hear you. But honestly, true panic doesn't usually look like a Hollywood movie. It's quieter. It's heavier. Claire dropped her phone. It clattered hard against the laminate kitchen counter, and she did the only thing her stunned brain could process. She ran to the front door. She grabbed the brass handle and twisted. The deadbolt was unlocked, the knob turned freely, but the door wouldn't budge. She pushed her shoulder against the heavy wood, but it felt like pushing against a brick wall. From the other side, through the thin gaps in the doorframe, she heard the thick, mechanical clicking of a heavy-duty ratchet strap being tightened. He had strapped the exterior doorknob to the structural pillar of her porch. She was sealed in. She backed away, her breathing turning shallow and fast, and sprinted into the living room to try the front-facing window. She unlatched the lock and shoved upward. Nothing. She pushed harder, her palms sweating against the vinyl frame, but it was completely immobilized. And that's when she looked closer at the frame. Driven straight through the vinyl, deep into the wooden studs of the wall, were 4 heavy-gauge construction screws. They were new. The metal shavings were still sitting on her windowsill. He hadn't just followed her home. He had been here for hours, quietly altering her house while she was at work. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the end table, her knuckles white. She was going to smash the pane. But as she raised it, her phone, still sitting on the kitchen counter, pinged again. A second text. It echoed in the quiet house. She didn't want to look. She wanted to smash the glass. But the psychological hold was already working. She slowly walked back to the kitchen, leaving the lamp on the couch, and picked up the phone. "Look down," the message read. Claire looked down at the floorboards directly beneath the kitchen window. Tucked into the corner, half hidden behind a potted fern, was a cheap, battery-operated baby monitor. The little green power light was on. He was listening to her breathe. A third text immediately followed. "Break the glass and I come in. Play the game and you live until morning. Go to the hallway closet. Top shelf." We don't know exactly how long Claire stood there in the dark, staring at that little plastic baby monitor, but based on the forensic timeline unearthed much later, she spent the next 4 hours participating in a psychological torture chamber inside the very place she was supposed to feel safest. When Detective Eris Thorne walked into Claire's duplex 2 days later, he wasn't looking for a crime scene. It was a standard wellness check requested by her nursing supervisor after she missed 2 consecutive shifts. But as Thorne stepped through the back door, which the fire department had to pry open with a Halligan bar, the smell hit him immediately. It was a thick, metallic tang of copper mixed with the stale, sour odor of old adrenaline and sweat. Claire was gone. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. But the living room looked like the aftermath of a bizarre, ritualistic tornado. Furniture was pushed against the walls. The carpets had been meticulously rolled up, and placed in the dead center of the bare wooden floor was a digital kitchen timer, perfectly zeroed out, surrounded by a circle of 6 more Polaroid photographs. Thorne picked one up, using his pen. It was a photo of Claire, crying, holding a pair of heavy garden shears, staring at the camera. In the background of the photo, Thorne could see her own living room clock. The time was 3:14 a.m. Now, at this point in an investigation, real life is messy. Detectives don't immediately leap to the idea of a sophisticated, game-playing serial predator. They look at the statistics. And statistically, when a woman vanishes from a locked home with signs of a struggle, you look at the men in her life. Thorne and his partner canvassed the neighborhood, digging through stale coffee and junk mail back at the precinct, piecing together Claire's recent history. And they found a glaring, neon red flag. 6 months prior, Claire had broken up with a guy named Mark. Mark was bad news, a volatile construction contractor with a history of domestic disputes and a recently expired restraining order Claire had filed against him. He had the tools to drill screws into window frames. He had the ratchet straps. And just a week before Claire vanished, Mark had left a drunk, rambling voicemail on her phone, ending with the words, "You'll see what it feels like to be locked out." It was neat. It was logical. It gave the terrifying, chaotic scene at the duplex a grounded, understandable face. The detectives thought they had their guy. They dragged Mark into the fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the precinct later that night. Thorne laid out the photos of Claire's barricaded house. Mark was sweating profusely. He was shaking, stumbling over his words, and avoiding eye contact. He was acting exactly the way a guilty man acts when the walls are closing in. Thorne leaned over the table, pressing him, waiting for the confession to spill. But here's the catch. And it's the kind of procedural wall that haunts investigators. Mark wasn't sweating because he kidnapped Claire. He was sweating because he was a mid-level amphetamine distributor who thought Thorne had just busted him for a drug run. When Thorne finally pushed hard enough, Mark cracked, but not about Claire. He gave up his alibi, terrified but desperate to avoid a murder charge. Mark had been sitting in the back room of an illegal poker game behind a strip mall 80 miles away on the night Claire disappeared. The police pulled the security footage from the alleyway. And there was Mark, smoking a cigarette on camera at the exact moment the Polaroids of Claire were being taken in her kitchen. Thorne sat at his desk, staring at the security stills, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The clean narrative collapsed entirely. Mark was a dead end. This wasn't an angry ex-boyfriend. This wasn't a crime of passion. And as Thorne sat there, rubbing his tired eyes, his desk phone rang. It was dispatch. They had another scene. Across town, in a wealthy, gated suburb, a landscaper had just found his client's front door strapped shut from the outside. Thorne felt all the blood leave his face. He realized they weren't dealing with a stalker. They were dealing with a ghost who was just getting started. And this time, when Thorne arrived at the second house, he found out what happens when a victim refuses to play the game. And honestly, this is the moment in the timeline where the case shifted from a localized tragedy into a full-blown nightmare. It's the point where seasoned cops stop trusting their own instincts. Now at this point, Thorne was running on stale coffee and pure adrenaline. He pulls into this neighborhood called Oak Creek. It's the kind of pristine, heavily governed subdivision where the biggest neighborhood crisis is someone leaving their trash cans out a day too long. It's 9 a.m. The sky is a brilliant, ignorant blue. A rogue lawn sprinkler is lazily ticking back and forth across a perfectly manicured yard. The mundane reality of the environment actually made the whole thing feel so much worse. The landscaper, a college kid holding a rake, was sitting on the curb, pale as a sheet, just pointing a trembling hand at the front door. And there they were. Two heavy yellow ratchet straps bolted directly into the brickwork, holding the front door flush against the frame. Same hardware, same method. Thorne and his partner cut the straps and drew their weapons. The smell hit them the second the door cracked open. It's that horrible, unforgettable mix of stale air, Glade plug-ins, and the sharp, metallic tang of deep arterial blood. The victim was a 42-year-old tax attorney named David Hirsch. But unlike Claire's house, which was eerily neat, David's house was a war zone. Lamps were shattered. The drywall in the hallway was punched in. A heavy, iron fire poker lay bent on the carpet. David hadn't just waited patiently. He had refused to play whatever sick game this ghost had set up. He had fought back. They found him lying in the hallway connecting the kitchen to the back patio. The sliding glass door behind him was completely shattered. At first glance, the narrative seemed obvious. The detectives logged it as a frantic escape attempt. They assumed David tried to smash his way out into the backyard and the killer caught him from behind. It made sense. At least it made sense for about 20 minutes. But this is where the procedural messiness of real police work rears its head. Thorne knelt down by the sliding glass door and looked at the shards. The glass wasn't on the patio. All the broken glass was pushed inward, scattered across the kitchen tile. The door hadn't been broken from the inside. Someone had smashed it from the outside to get in. And when Thorne looked closer at the latch, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The door was already unlocked. The clean narrative collapsed entirely. If the killer broke in from the backyard, why did he strap the front door shut from the outside? It took Thorne 3 hours to find the answer, and it came in the form of a piece of evidence so mundane it almost got overlooked. While canvassing the front yard, checking the mulch for footprints, Thorne noticed a black plastic bag tucked behind a rhododendron bush directly beneath the front window. Inside the bag was an old, cheap, scuffed-up Sony cassette player. It was wired to a pair of bulky, battery-powered external speakers. Thorne put on latex gloves, rewound the tape, and hit play. For the first few seconds, there was just tape hiss. And then, deafeningly loud through the speakers, came the grinding, unmistakable sound of a power drill. Then, the heavy thud of boots on a wooden porch. Then, the rhythmic, metallic crank, crank, crank of a ratchet strap tightening. Then, a man's voice, muffled and angry, swearing as he supposedly rattled the front doorknob. Thorne froze. He stopped the tape. He played it again. And then, the terrifying, brilliant cruelty of the trap finally dawned on him. The killer wasn't standing on the porch terrifying his victims. He wasn't a voyeur. He was a trapper. He had simply planted the tape recorder in the bushes on a timer. The terrifying noises of the house being barricaded, the drills, the footsteps, it was all pre-recorded audio. It was a hunting blind. The killer uses the audio to simulate a violent break-in at the front of the house. The victim wakes up, absolutely paralyzed with fear. They hear someone drilling their front door shut. What is the natural, unavoidable human instinct? You back away from the noise. You retreat. You slowly backpedal down your hallway, eyes locked in terror on your front door, retreating into the deepest, darkest, supposedly safest part of your house. But while the tape is playing loudly on the front porch, drawing all of the victim's panicked attention, the killer is already inside. He had slipped in silently through an unlocked back window hours earlier. He wasn't trying to break in. He was just standing in the dark at the end of the hallway, waiting for you to slowly, blindly back right into him. Thorne had to sit down on the curb. His mind flashed immediately back to Claire's house. He thought about those scattered Polaroids. The final, blurry photo of her dark hallway. She wasn't taking a picture of an intruder. She was taking a flash photograph to see if the front door was secure, backing away from the phantom noises on her porch, holding a kitchen knife, completely unaware that the killer had already stepped out of her bathroom right behind her. The emotional toll of that realization of Claire's absolute agonizing vulnerability in her final moments hung over the department like a suffocating blanket. The houses would eventually be cleaned, the straps removed, the neighborhoods returning to their quiet routines, but the psychological rot remained. And the final detail, the one that still keeps Thorne awake at night, came a week later when the audio forensics lab cleaned up the cassette tape found in David's bushes. They listened to the whole 45-minute recording. It was just an endless, looping loop of terrifying break-in sounds. But right at the 43-minute mark, the sound effects abruptly cut out. There was 10 seconds of dead, static air. And then, a calm, deeply ordinary male voice leaned right into the microphone. It didn't sound like a monster. It sounded like a neighbor asking to borrow a shovel. He just whispered, "You can turn around now."